Woody Harrelson doesn't just live in the spotlight of Hollywood. He also has to live in a silent war that has lasted for many decades, where pain and willpower always go hand in hand in every choice. Behind the familiar smile on screen is a man constantly torn between two selves, a star recognized by the whole world and a human being who always seeks to withdraw from the very world that created him. Every time he steps onto the red carpet, Woody doesn't just bring along fame, but also carries a feeling of alienation from his own image. Fame doesn't bring a sense of belonging, but on the contrary, creates an increasingly large void in his heart. He lives between two worlds that never blend into each other. One world of lights, scripts, and endless expectations, and another world where he seeks silence, nature, and the feeling of being himself. That parallel existence is not a simple choice, but more like a state of survival, where he is forced to learn how to separate himself so as not to be swallowed by his own fame. It is a journey full of contradictions, where external success cannot fill the cracks inside, and where every public smile comes with an inner battle that no one sees. Even though he carries deep inner turmoil, Woody Harrelson has still built an amazing film career, spanning more than 4 decades. He first became known to the public through the role of Woody Boyd in the legendary sitcom Cheers, a role that helped him win an Emmy in 1989 and become a familiar face on American television. From there, he moved into film with a series of impressive roles in White Men Can't Jump, 1992, Natural Born Killers, 1994, and The People vs. Larry Flynt, 1996, the film that brought him his first Oscar nomination for Best Actor. Later, he continued to affirm his position through major works like No Country for Old Men, 2007, The Hunger Games series, 2012-2015, in the role of Hamish Abernethy, Zombieland, 2009-2019, and True Detective, 2014, the television series that earned him another Emmy nomination. With 3 Oscar nominations, multiple SAG and Emmy Awards, Woody Harrelson is considered one of the most versatile and enduring actors of modern Hollywood, successful in both commercial films and leaving a deep mark in artistic cinema. Before continuing the journey behind Woody Harrelson's life, please hit like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss deeper stories behind the Hollywood spotlight. Every bit of your support is a way to accompany those destinies that have had to live between fame and the dark corners no one sees. Woody was born in Texas in a family where, from a very young age, he had to learn to understand that life is not always fair. His father, Charles Harrelson, was not an ordinary man in the eyes of society, but a name associated with serious crimes, a ghost that would later always haunt Woody like an unchangeable destiny. While other children grew up with simple dreams and protection from family, Woody grew up in the heavy silence of a truth he did not choose. Just the Harrelson name alone was enough to make others look at him with a different eye. Not like an innocent child, but like a continuation of a dark story that he had never written. Meanwhile, his mother had to shoulder the entire family alone, being both father and mother, in a life full of shortages and pressure. She worked non-stop to raise 3 children, trying to give them the most stable life possible in an unstable situation. But no matter how hard she tried, she could not completely shield Woody from society's gaze. At school, on the street, or even in small conversations, the boy always felt the difference. People didn't need to say it outright, but the distance in their eyes was enough for Woody to understand that he was not like other children. There was something in him that was always placed outside the boundary of normalcy, as if he was carrying something that did not belong to himself. As he grew up, that feeling did not disappear, but only became clearer. Woody began to understand that he was not just a child in the eyes of others, but also the son of a man who had committed crimes. That identity was not chosen by him, but became what shaped the way the world perceived him. This created a deep crack in Woody's psychology. a crack that was not loud but persistent. He began to withdraw into himself, not because he hated the world, but because he did not know how to stand in that world without being hurt more. In those childhood years, Woody did not have much space to express himself fully. Economic difficulties combined with social pressure kept family life in a state of silent tension. There were days when simply having enough to eat was already a blessing. There were days when the silence in the small house became so heavy that a child like Woody could feel the fatigue of the adults around him. But what affected him most deeply was not material deprivation, but the feeling of being seen as a special case in his own community. No one directly pushed Woody out of society, but society created an invisible distance between him and others. That distance made him gradually form a self-defense mechanism, not fully integrating, not fully trusting, and also not allowing himself to belong anywhere completely. That was how a child learned to survive in a world he could not control. From a very early age, Woody began to develop his own inner world, where he could separate himself from the gaze of others. In that world, he was not the son of a man with a criminal past, not a name defined by circumstances, but just himself, a child trying to understand the meaning of existing. That separation, though unconscious, became the foundation for the way he lived later, both on stage and in real life. But behind that separation was not peace, but a form of prolonged loneliness. A child could not fully understand why he was looked at differently, but he felt that difference very clearly in every moment of life, and that loneliness became an indelible part of Woody Harrelson, a part that would follow him throughout his journey to adulthood, and later, even when he had become a big star of Hollywood. Woody Harrelson stepped into his teenage years with a mental crack that became increasingly clear, where the outside world was no longer a place where he felt he belonged. In school, he was not a standout child, nor was he noticed in a positive way. On the contrary, Woody often carried a feeling of being lost, as if standing on the sidelines of every conversation, every group of friends, every natural connection that others seemed to have so easily. No one needed to say it out loud, but he always felt he was the different one. Someone who did not fully blend into the common flow of the youth around him. That isolation did not always come from direct rejection, but sometimes just from prolonged silences, fleeting glances, or simply the feeling of not being called by name in any group. Woody began to withdraw more, not because he did not want to connect, but because every time he tried to connect, it seemed to make him realize the gap between himself and the world was even larger. In that silence, something began to form inside him, an increasingly deep inner world, where he could observe life instead of having to participate directly in it. It was in this period that the stage began to appear as the first truly meaningful escape in Woody's life. At first, it was just small school activities, unimportant performances. But for him, it was the only place where his difference was no longer a burden. When standing on stage, he was no longer the boy carrying the surname that society looked at with wary eyes. Nor was he the person who always felt he stood outside everything. In that moment, Woody could become someone else, a character not bound by the past or prejudice. Acting gradually became a form of language that he did not need to explain in words. It allowed him to exist in a way that everyday life could not allow. Each role was like a door leading him out of himself, out of the heavy emotions he did not know how to express. And the deeper he stepped into that world, Woody increasingly realized that he was not only playing other people, but was gradually creating a different version of himself, a version that could endure the world he was living in. But what began as a release gradually turned into a more complex mechanism in his mind. When standing in front of others, Woody learned to build an identity suitable for each role, each situation, each gaze from the audience. He no longer just acted on stage, but began to carry those role layers into life outside as well. Gradually, the boundary between the real person and the character became blurred, not in a clear or sudden way, but through a slow, almost imperceptible process. At a deeper level, Woody began to feel that there were two versions of himself coexisting. One version was silent, sensitive, carrying all the memories of loneliness and pressure from childhood. And another version, more confident, more flexible, able to step into any space without breaking. These two versions did not fight directly but always existed in parallel, like two streams that never fully merged into each other. The scariest thing was not the existence of those two entities, but the fact that Woody began to get used to it. He learned to switch between them naturally, almost unconsciously. When he needed to face the world, he used the second identity. When he was alone, he returned to the first entity, where all real emotions remained intact, and sometimes heavy to the point of being hard to bear. This separation, which began from his teenage years, became the foundation for Woody Harrelson's entire later life. It did not disappear when he grew up, did not dissolve when he became an actor, and was not erased by fame. On the contrary, it continued to develop with him, becoming an inseparable part of the way he existed between the world and himself. When Woody Harrelson stepped into the role of Woody Boyd in the legendary sitcom Cheers, his life seemed to have turned to a completely new page, where the stage lights were no longer small school performances, but a national television system with millions of people watching every week. That role brought him attention that very few young actors could achieve in such a short time. From an unfamiliar face, Woody quickly became part of American pop culture, a character loved for his naivety, sincerity, and natural humor. But behind that explosion, it was not a feeling of stability or completeness, but a form of mental chaos that was hard to name. Fame came too fast, causing everything around Woody to change almost immediately. The once strange glances became familiar, but at the same time became heavier. He was no longer an actor looking for a foothold, but had become a fixed image in the eyes of the public. A character that the audience expected to always keep the right personality, the right energy, the right image they had loved. That created an invisible but constant pressure, where Woody not only had to act on screen, but also had to maintain a stable version of himself in real life. Over time, the feeling of no longer being in control of his own image began to appear more clearly. Every time he appeared in public, every interview, every look from fans contributed to shaping a version of Woody that he did not fully control. He gradually realized that the more successful he became, the more he was narrowed down into a mold created by others. The inner freedom he once found on the small stage in his teenage years was now replaced by a larger structure, where he had to maintain the consistency of a public figure. This transition created an increasingly large gap between the real person and the external image. On the outside, Woody Boyd was a character who brought laughter, comfort, and a sense of safety to the audience. But inside, Woody Harrelson began to feel more clearly the separation between himself and that role. He could not completely return to his old self, but he could not completely become the character the world expected. The two inner worlds he had formed from his teenage years now no longer just existed in parallel, but began to collide in his daily experiences. What is worth noting is that while everyone looked at Woody and saw a career on the rise, a clear success story, inside him there appeared a completely opposite state. It was not a loud crisis or a clear breakdown, but a prolonged feeling of emptiness, hard to name, hard to share, and even harder to explain when standing at the peak of fame. He began to realize that success did not mean inner stability, and the spotlight did not have the ability to fill the voids that had existed for a very long time inside him. The higher Woody rose in position, the more he felt he stood far away from his own self. Each new success did not bring a feeling of completion, but only made clearer the division between the person inside and the image outside. He began to live in a strange state, where recognition from the outside world no longer corresponded with the feeling inside. This caused him to fall into a special form of isolation, not loneliness because of lacking people around, but loneliness when surrounded by attention yet not being seen as his true self. In this period, Woody did not talk much about his emotions, but subtle changes in the way he existed began to appear. He worked, appeared, completed roles, but always carried an inner silence that was hard to explain. It was the time when his career was expanding, but he himself began to shrink inward. A silent paradox formed. The more he was recognized, the harder it was for him to recognize himself. And that very paradox became the foundation for a longer journey, where fame no longer was the destination, but became part of an inner struggle that lasted for many decades afterward. The spotlight from Cheers had not even settled down when Hollywood quickly began shaping Woody Harrelson in a way he could not control. In the eyes of the public and the entire entertainment industry, he was no longer simply an actor developing his career, but had become a model that needed to be maintained. Each subsequent role was not only an artistic choice, but also part of the expectations Hollywood placed on his shoulders. People did not just want to see Woody Harrelson act well, they wanted to see him always resemble the version they had known, had loved, had labeled, and it was from here that the pressure began shifting from success to responsibility. At the same time, his family past began to become an inseparable part of his public image. The story about his father, Charles Harrelson, a man involved in serious crimes, was continuously mentioned by the press as a detail that could not be overlooked. Even though Woody was not the one who created that past, he still had to carry it like part of his public identity. Every interview, every article, every conversation about him would more or less return to questions about family, about origins, about the darkness he had never chosen. This made the boundary between the real person and the public image increasingly blurred, because he was not only judged through his career, but also through things outside his control. In every public appearance, Woody began to feel more clearly the heaviness of the gaze. It was no longer simple curiosity for an actor, but continuous observation for a figure that had been built. He had to step out with a stable state, had to maintain energy, had to meet the invisible expectations that audiences and the media placed on him. Gradually, appearing in public no longer felt natural, but became a form of mental obligation. He was not only living his own life, but also maintaining a version of himself to serve the image that had been created. Fame, which was once seen as the reward of success, began to turn into a kind of responsibility that could not be removed. Each career decision not only affected his career, but also affected the way the public perceived his entire person. The freedom he once felt when stepping onto the stage in his teenage years now almost disappeared, replaced instead by a tight structure of expectations, image, and continuous maintenance. He began to understand that in Hollywood, success never stood still. It always came with the pressure to keep it from falling. It was in this period that the inner conflict in Woody became clearer than ever. One part of him was still the artist who wanted to explore, wanted to experiment, wanted to live truly with emotions and creative freedom. But the remaining part was bound by the responsibility of the public image, by audience expectations, by an entire system operating around him. Those two parts did not confront each other directly, but always existed in a state of silent tension, like two forces pulling in opposite directions within the same person. The further he advanced in his career, the clearer the feeling of being trapped in his own success became. The milestones the world looked at as proof of glory instead became anchor points, holding him in an image that could not be changed. He could not easily withdraw, nor could he easily change direction without facing the attention of the entire industry. Success, instead of opening up freedom, created a narrower space where every step was observed and interpreted. Deep down, Woody began to realize something hard to accept. He no longer fully belonged to himself anymore. One part of him had become the property of the public, of the media, of Hollywood, and the remaining part, the quietest part, the truest part, was pushed deeper inside, where no one could see. This very division caused him to fall into a special state of existence, where success was no longer the destination, but became an invisible cage, beautiful but impossible to escape. The prolonged tension between the public image and the true person inside Woody Harrelson did not disappear over time, but only became heavier as his career continued to expand. While Hollywood still demanded continuous presence, new roles, dense schedules, and ever-increasing expectations, Woody began to have longer periods of silence not for rest, but to escape the feeling of being surrounded by his own life. It was not a sudden decision, but a gradual withdrawal process, almost unnoticed by anyone until it had become a clear part of who he was. He began to seek out places far from the center of the entertainment industry, places without lights, without lenses, without conversations revolving around fame. Nature became the first space where Woody felt he could breathe normally. Among the trees, the sea, and the prolonged quiet, he no longer had to maintain any image at all. No more roles, no more expectations, no more gazes defining who he was. In those moments, Woody was no longer a Hollywood star, but simply a human being trying to find the balance that had been lost for a very long time. His lifestyle gradually changed in a direction that many people called hippie. But for Woody, it was not a trend or a statement, but a natural reaction to prolonged pressure. He began to care about more basic things of existence, the way of eating, the way of slowing down, the way of listening to his body and mind, instead of chasing the rhythm of the outside world. Becoming vegetarian became a part of daily life, not like a fashion choice, but as a way to reduce the heaviness and the feeling of living. Meditation and silence also gradually became habits, helping him face thoughts that before he had always been swept away by work and fame. However, the most important thing in this period was not the outward change, but the deep reason inside that made him withdraw from Hollywood. It was not the usual fatigue of an actor after many years of work, but a form of inner pressure that had accumulated for a very long time. From childhood, from isolation, from identity defined by others, and from the feeling of never fully belonging anywhere. Withdrawing from the entertainment center was not a simple act of seeking peace, but a way to avoid facing the inner conflicts that he had never been able to resolve. While the outside world still looked at Woody Harrelson as a successful actor continuing to develop his career, inside him he had begun to form a completely different living structure, a parallel life, where he was no longer bound by the public image, where he could exist as a separate human being, detached from the roles and the expectations. These two lives did not exclude each other, but they also did not merge into one. They existed simultaneously, like two parallel streams that never fully intersected. In Hollywood, Woody still appeared when necessary, still took on roles, still participated in the system he had stepped into a long time ago, but each time he returned, he carried an invisible distance, as if the most important part of his person had stayed in another place, where there were no cameras and no evaluation. On the contrary, when he left Hollywood, he did not completely escape it because fame, memories, and public image still always followed him like an inseparable part. This very parallel existence created a special state of living where Woody did not fully belong to any world completely. He was no longer completely an actor caught in the wheel of Hollywood, but he was also not completely a person living outside that system. He stood at the boundary between two worlds, building for himself a separate space where he could temporarily escape the pressure from both sides, but never completely escape himself. This withdrawal, to outsiders, might look like a peaceful choice, but for Woody, it carried a much more complex color. It was a way of existing, a way of keeping balance in a life that had been divided in two for a very long time. And it was in this period that his second life not only began to become clearer, but also became an indispensable part in the way he continued to live and exist between the world he both belonged to and never fully belonged to. After establishing for himself an increasingly clear distance from the Hollywood lifestyle, Woody Harrelson did not stop at spatial or lifestyle withdrawal, but gradually formed a clearer attitude toward the entire system he belonged to. Hollywood, in the eyes of many people, is the peak of art and fame. But for Woody, it was also a mechanism full of unspoken rules, where image, revenue, and commerce were sometimes placed above creative freedom. This very awareness made him begin to change the way he chose his career path, no longer basing it only on fame or project scale, but on his personal feeling about the authenticity of the role. He began to prioritize independent films, smaller projects that offered wider creative space, where actors were not framed in ready-made formulas. These choices did not always bring great commercial success, but they helped Woody maintain a sense of connection with art in a way he considered more authentic. In those films, he was not part of a giant entertainment machine, but an artist who could experiment, fail, and express more complex aspects of human nature. His distance from Hollywood standards became increasingly clear. While the industry continued to operate toward optimizing image, revenue, and safety in content choices, Woody went in the opposite direction, seeking roles that were rougher, less perfect, and sometimes more unpredictable. This made him become different in the eyes of many people, not in a loud way, but in a quiet but clear way, like a person standing outside the main flow of the system. The image of Woody Harrelson from then on gradually took shape as an artist who did not fully belong to the Hollywood mold. He did not try to become a symbol of perfection, nor did he try to maintain a safe image to serve the public. Instead, he accepted the inconsistency in himself, accepted not being fully understood, and accepted standing outside part of the industry that had made his name. This very acceptance made him become a special kind of figure in Hollywood. Not easy to classify, not easy to label, and not easy to control. However, this path also carried an increasingly clear inner contradiction. On one hand, Woody still achieved commercial success with big films, global projects, where he continued to be recognized as an actor with appeal and talent. But on the other hand, each time he stepped into such projects, he had to face the difference between the commercial world and his need for personal freedom. Success was no longer a purely positive experience, but became a space where he had to continuously balance between two opposing poles. One side was the expectations of the industry, the other side was the need to be himself. In that process, Woody did not publicly oppose Hollywood, nor did he leave it completely. Instead, he chose an intermediate way of existing, where he both participated in the system and kept distance from it. He did not deny the value of commercial success, but he also did not let it define his entire person. This fragile balance helped him maintain a long career while keeping for himself a private space to exist as an independent individual. Over time, this lifestyle and viewpoint made Woody Harrelson become a rather rare image in Hollywood. A person who was both successful in the system and not completely belonging to that system. He did not try to become a symbol of rebellion, but his choices themselves created a clear distance from conventional standards. And in that distance, another person of Woody continued to exist and develop, not completely defined by roles, by fame, or by any framework that the entertainment industry set. After many long years existing between two worlds, one side Hollywood full of lights and pressure, the other a free life separated from the system, Woody Harrelson gradually found another anchor, not belonging to fame or art, but to something simpler yet also more profound: love and family. In that journey, the appearance of Laura Louie did not carry the nature of a noisy turning point, but was like a slow, steady flow that gradually reshaped the way he viewed life. Laura was not a person of Hollywood, did not live in the vortex of fame that Woody had grown familiar with, and that very fact created a different balance right from the beginning. Their relationship was not built on the foundation of spotlight, but based on stability, understanding, and a form of connection that needed no show. In a world where everything around Woody tended to turn into public image, Laura became a rare private space where he did not need to play anyone. Over time, that relationship developed into a long-lasting bond, not dominated by the speed of the entertainment industry, but operating at a slower, more sustainable rhythm. When they built a family and had children, Woody's life began to step into another layer of meaning. The role of a father was not simply a new responsibility, but also a profound change in the way he viewed himself and the world around him. Things that previously occupied his entire mind, like fame, roles, or career pressure, gradually had to share space with completely different priorities. The presence of children made him face a simpler, yet more authentic form of reality, where value was no longer measured by public recognition, but by presence and responsibility in every moment of life. However, even in that stable family environment, the inner instabilities that had existed for a long time in Woody did not completely disappear. Family brought him balance, but could not completely erase the layers of memories, the invisible pressures that had formed from childhood and career. He was still the person who had lived many years between two worlds, still carried within him the contradictions between freedom and fame, between his true self and the public image. But the difference was that, in the family space, those contradictions no longer occupied his entire mental space as before. The role of father and husband brought Woody an emotional anchor that he had lacked for most of his life. It did not solve all the inner conflicts, but helped him have a more stable foundation to stand firm amid the fluctuations of his career. Instead of being completely swept into the vortex of Hollywood, he began to learn how to separate himself at different levels, returning to family as a way to rebalance himself. In this period, private life was no longer just the secondary part of his career, but became the main foundation that helped him maintain long-term existence in both worlds. Normal moments in the family meals, simple conversations, being present with the children gradually became more valuable than successes on screen, not because his career lost meaning, but because it was no longer the only factor defining who he was. Nevertheless, this stability was not an absolute state. It was like a fragile balance, always needing to be maintained among many different poles. Hollywood still existed there, still continued to call his name through new projects, new roles, while family life pulled him toward a completely different rhythm. Woody Harrelson, therefore, never truly stepped out of the division of his life, but only learned how to live with it, adjust it, and find ways not to let it break everything he had built. After finding a relatively stable anchor in family, Woody Harrelson continued to take his life further away from the center of the entertainment industry, where he had lived for most of his adult life. The decision to move to Maui, Hawaii, was not simply a change of residence, but like a deliberate step of withdrawal from the entire pace of life that had once shaped who he was. There was no longer the noise of Hollywood, no longer dense schedules, no longer continuous pressures from the media or the public. Only a vast space of nature remained, where everything happened more slowly, more quietly, and with less interference. Maui became a form of spiritual survival space for Woody, where he could temporarily remove the layers of roles he had carried for many years. Between the sea, the trees, and the prolonged silence, he no longer had to maintain the image of a Hollywood star, nor did he have to meet any expectations from the outside. Life there was much simpler than the previous pace, not dominated by events, film premieres, or promotional schedules. This very simplicity created a feeling of freedom that he could hardly find anywhere else in the entertainment industry. From here, Woody's presence in Hollywood began to decrease deliberately. He still participated in film projects, still appeared in big movies when necessary, but no longer maintained the continuous frequency as before. Each appearance became a considered choice, rather than a mandatory part of the profession. This helped him establish a clearer boundary between work and personal life, something that had almost not existed before. Hollywood no longer occupied his entire living space, but became only a part of it, more separated, more controlled. The change in living environment also led to a change in the way Woody Harrelson viewed his own career. Instead of letting fame and work shape his entire life, he began to place them in a more specific, more limited position, Work became a part of life rather than the sole center. This did not diminish his career, but changed the way he interacted with it. He was no longer completely swept into the vortex of the industry, but could step in and step out more proactively. However, even though the outside environment became much quieter, the inner pressures Woody had carried for many years before did not completely disappear. The silence of Maui did not have the ability to erase the memories, the contradictions, or the deep psychological layers that had formed from childhood and been reinforced through each stage of his career. Instead, it only made those things become clearer in the silent space. When there was no longer outside noise to cover them up, the inner thoughts had the opportunity to appear more fully, sometimes even clearer than before. In that quietness, Woody Harrelson began to face a different form of reality, where he was no longer distracted by schedules or work, but had to confront himself directly. This was not absolute peace, but a fragile balance between escape and confrontation. He could leave Hollywood physically, but he could not completely detach from it mentally. Fame, memories, and past experiences still existed as an inseparable part of who he was. Therefore, life in Maui was not the end of the inner journey, but another stage of it, a stage where Woody was no longer pulled too fast by the outside world, but had to learn how to live with what existed inside him. Between the quiet of nature and the complexity of the inner self, he continued to maintain the parallel existence of the two worlds that had shaped his life from a very long time before. Even though he had withdrawn to Maui and built a more separate life from the whirlwind of Hollywood, Woody Harrelson still did not completely disappear from the screen. On the contrary, at a time when many people thought he was gradually stepping away from the lights, Woody entered a new phase of success that was stronger and more widespread than before. This return did not happen like a sudden explosion, but like a natural flow, where his name continued to be affirmed through large-scale film projects, especially the role in the Hunger Games series, bringing him back to the center of global pop culture. In the role of Hamish Abernathy, Woody did not simply appear as a supporting actor in a major film franchise, but became a character with psychological depth, remembered by audiences around the world. The film was a resounding success, expanding his influence beyond the scope of a previous generation of viewers, bringing him back to the center of Hollywood in a way few could have predicted. His fame once again rose to a global level, not only in the television field as before, but in large-scale commercial cinema as well. However, what was noteworthy was not in that return, but in the silence inside it. Even while standing amid brilliant commercial successes, even while his name appeared globally, Woody Harrelson did not experience the sense of elation that people usually associate with such milestones. Success came once again, but this time it did not bring a corresponding interchange. He still performed the roles, still participated in major projects, still received public recognition, but inside everything seemed to remain in the same state as before. The feeling of repetition began to appear more clearly in him. This was no longer the first time Woody had achieved major success, and that very fact made every new experience no longer carry the breakthrough quality it once had. The praises, media attention, and recognition from the industry all still happened like a familiar cycle, but no longer had the ability to create profound change in his inner emotions. Success still came, but the feeling of liberation or completion no longer seemed to accompany it. While the outside world continued to see Woody as a film icon at a new peak, inside him, the two parallel lives he had carried for a long time became even clearer and more separate. One side was the public image, where he was still a successful, beloved, recognized actor invited into big projects. The other side was his inner and personal life, where he continued to maintain separation from Hollywood, living slower, quieter, and further from the pace of the industry he was still participating in. The gap between these two worlds was no longer vague as before, but gradually became clearer and harder to narrow over time. Each time he appeared on screen, Woody became a version of himself that the public expected, But each time he left the lights, he returned to a completely different space, where those expectations no longer existed. The transition between these two states no longer felt like simple adaptation, but like stepping through two different realities, each with its own rules and feelings. This increasingly deep separation made Woody Harrelson's inner world more complex. Success did not disappear, fame did not decline, but the feeling of unity between the person and his life seemed increasingly distant. He still continued to work, still continued to make films, but at the same time, he also continued to live in a state of parallel existence, where image and essence no longer fully matched. And in that parallelism, one thing gradually became clear. Woody Harrelson's career was no longer a simple journey upward or downward, but a repeated chain of external success and internal emptiness, a prolonged cycle, where the light of fame was no longer strong enough to erase the increasingly deep separation between the two lives he had lived for many decades. After experiencing many decades, standing between two worlds, one side the brilliant lights of Hollywood, the other a separate life in Maui, Woody Harrelson was no longer just facing the contradiction between work and personal life, but began to face something deeper and harder to name, the fracture in his own identity. This was no longer a story about career choices or lifestyle, but a story about a person gradually losing the feeling of unity within himself. On the surface, Woody was still a successful actor, a familiar face in global cinema, appearing in major projects, recognized and loved by the public. But inside him, the boundary between the true person and the public person had become so fragile that it was almost impossible to distinguish. Each time he stepped in front of the camera, he was not only portraying a role, but also activating a version already pre-shaped in the eyes of the audience. That version was stable, consistent, easily recognizable, but not completely his. The problem began to appear when the existence of these two versions was no longer clearly defined as before. In personal life, Woody tried to keep the part of his true self, a man living close to nature, away from the noise, seeking simplicity and freedom. But when he returned to Hollywood, he had to step into a completely different structure, where his public image was maintained as an independent entity with its own life, its own expectations, and almost impossible to change at will. Over time, the transition between these two states was no longer simple. It no longer felt like going to work and then coming home, but became a form of continuous psychological shift, where Woody had to adjust himself to fit each space. This created a prolonged state of fatigue, not physical exhaustion, but a silent mental drain that accumulated over the years. He began to live with the feeling that there was no place that fully belonged to him. In Hollywood, he was a defined image. In his private life, he was a person trying to escape those definitions. But the paradox lay in the fact that the more he tried to escape, the more he realized that the public image had become an inseparable part of himself. He could not remove it, nor could he completely dissolve into it. This simultaneous existence caused Woody to fall into a state he could not clearly name, not completely a Hollywood star in the full sense, but also not completely an ordinary person living outside that system. The feeling of not belonging began to become a prolonged state in him. Not fully belonging to Hollywood, but also not completely belonging to the separate world he had built for himself. Both worlds existed, but neither world brought a complete feeling of self. This very thing made Woody begin to look back at his own career, not just as a series of successes, but as a prolonged trade-off journey, where every step forward came with a part of his personal identity lost. The contradiction between fame and identity became clearer as he received more recognition. The public saw a Woody Harrelson who was stable, consistent, full of personality, and almost unchanged over time. But inside him was a constantly fluctuating inner flow, where questions about who am I never really had a definitive answer. Each new success that appeared did not bring a feeling of completion, but only made clearer the gap between the external image and the internal experience. Over time, the mental fatigue was no longer fleeting moments, but became a background part of life. Not a collapse, not a clear crisis, but a prolonged state where everything continued to operate, but the feeling of inner unity became increasingly hard to find. Woody still worked, still appeared, still participated in major projects, but always carried the feeling that an important part of himself was standing somewhere else, never fully stepping into the same space with the rest. It was in this period that Woody Harrelson was no longer just facing two parallel lives, but facing the fragmentation inside his own person, an identity that was no longer intact, no longer seamless, but divided into many parts, each existing in different circumstances, but never truly merging into one. And that was the quietest tragedy in his entire journey. Not losing success, but gradually losing the feeling of unity with himself. After going through the deep layers of identity separation and the feeling of no longer belonging fully to any world, Woody Harrelson still carried another shadow, silent but never disappearing. It was the shadow of his father, Charles Harrelson, a name tied to serious crimes that had become an inseparable part of the way the public perceived Woody. Even though he was not the one who created that past, he was the one who had to live with it throughout his entire life. His father was not just a family memory, but had become a media symbol, a detail always brought up whenever Woody Harrelson's name appeared. In many articles, interviews, or stories revolving around his career, his father's past was always included as an implicit explanation for who he was now. That made Woody never able to completely separate himself from the family story. Even though he tried to build his own path, that shadow always appeared like an unerasable background. From very early in his career, Woody had to learn to face the fact that he was not only perceived as an individual, but also as a continuation of a controversial family history. Every time he appeared in public, whether as an actor or in his personal life, there was always an implicit layer of meaning he could not control. His origins. This created a special pressure, not coming from his own choices, but from a past he had never participated in. Even so, Woody Harrelson did not choose to deny or completely avoid it. He still continued to build his career, continued to participate in major film projects, continued to create his own image in the eyes of the public. But the further he went, the more he realized that building a personal identity completely separate from his family past was almost impossible. Every success, every role, every step in his career had to exist in parallel with another story he could not change. This very coexistence created a feeling of being defined from the outside, where he himself did not fully control the way he was perceived. Even though he had talent, a clear career, and his own contributions to the film industry, in the eyes of many people, he was still always tied to a story bigger than himself. This did not only exist in the media, but gradually became part of the way he felt about himself. Over time, Woody began to understand that there were elements in his life that would always exist like an inseparable background layer. He could change his career. He could change his living environment. He could build a separate life in Maui, but he could not change the origin that had been assigned to him from when he was very young. And that very thing created a deeper form of contradiction between wanting to define himself and always being defined by factors outside his control. The influence of the family past did not stop at the social level, but also seeped into his inner life. It became a question that never really disappeared, whether a person could completely separate himself from what he was born into or not. Woody did not give a definitive answer, but his life clearly reflected the existence of that question in every stage. Even when he had reached the peak of his career, even when he had been recognized as a talented and influential actor, the shadow of his father still did not disappear. It did not appear loudly, did not take up the entire space, but always existed as a background part of the story. And that very silent existence made Woody Harrelson's journey not only the journey of an actor, but also the journey of a man who always had to live with a past he did not create. Yet it influenced the way the world perceived his entire life. After living many years in the tension between fame, family past, and personal identity, Woody Harrelson gradually built for himself a lifestyle he called freedom. But over time, the very concept of freedom began to take on a more complex meaning, no longer simply liberation from Hollywood pressure, but becoming a prolonged reaction to the limits he had once experienced. Leaving the center of the entertainment industry, living close to nature, limiting contact with the media, and reducing dependence on the system were not just personal choices, but also a way for him to keep the final balance in a life that had too many layers. At first, this freedom brought a feeling of relief. No more dense schedules, no more continuous public scrutiny, no more pressure to maintain a stable image in front of the camera. Woody could live at his own pace, could choose when to appear and when to withdraw. He was no longer completely caught in the vortex that many in the entertainment industry could not escape. However, over time, that freedom began to reveal another side, less visible. When staying away from the system for too long, Woody began to realize that freedom did not mean absolute peace. Detaching from the center of the industry brought quietness, but at the same time, it created an increasingly large distance from the world he was still part of. He no longer fully belonged to Hollywood, but he also did not fully belong to a life outside the system. That very gap created a subtle form of isolation, where freedom no longer carried a liberating feeling, but became a state of standing in between, unclear and unstable. In the private space he built, Woody could avoid external pressures, but he could not completely avoid his own thoughts. When there were no longer so many external factors dominating, inner questions began to appear more clearly, whether his choices were true freedom or just a way to retreat from things too difficult to face. The silence of the separated life sometimes did not bring serenity, but only made clearer the things that had existed inside for a very long time. One of the biggest paradoxes Woody had to face was the feeling of isolation appearing right in his own choice of freedom. He could control his living space, work pace, and level of contact with the outside world. But he could not completely control the feeling of separation that gradually formed over time. When he was no longer at the center of the industry, when he no longer appeared regularly in the main flow of Hollywood, he began to feel more clearly the separation from a part of the world he still belonged to in name. This created a profound contradiction between freedom and human connection. On one hand, Woody wanted to keep distance to protect his inner balance, to avoid the pressures that had once shaped his life for many years. On the other hand, that separation made natural connections with the surrounding environment harder to maintain. He did not fully integrate into the old world, but he also did not fully integrate into the new world. Existing between these two states made the feeling of belonging more vague than ever. Over time, Woody began to realize that freedom was not a fixed state, but a continuous balance between many opposing factors. If too close to the system, he would be caught in pressure and public image. But if too far from the system, he would face isolation and a gap in connection. That was why his life became a non-stop adjustment process, where there was no clear stopping point, only continuous change between levels of participation and withdrawal. This balance, although it helped him maintain life for a long time, always carried fragility. There was no fixed formula to keep it completely stable. Every decision, every role, every period of withdrawal or return could change the entire state. Woody Harrelson, in this stage of his life, was no longer just living between two worlds as before, but also had to continuously adjust the distance between them so as not to lose balance completely. And it was in that continuous adjustment that he continued to exist, not as a person who had found the final answer for his life, but as a person learning how to live with contradictions that never completely disappeared. After all those choices, those withdrawals, those returns, and those efforts to find balance, Woody Harrelson gradually arrived at a truth that could no longer be avoided. He had never truly belonged anywhere completely. Hollywood had created his name, brought him to heights of fame that very few people achieved, but at the same time, it had never completely seen him as a core part of the system. He existed in it, was recognized in it, but always kept an invisible distance from the very center of the industry he served. In the opposite direction, the separate life he built, where nature, quietness, and personal freedom played the central role, also did not completely become a place he truly belonged to. Even though he could live far from the lights, reduce his public presence, and seek a different rhythm of life, he still carried within him the inseparable imprint of Hollywood. Fame, memories, and the entire career journey still always existed as an unerasable background part, making him unable to fully dissolve into any world outside that industry. This very existence between two non-intersecting spaces made Woody Harrelson become a prolonged outsider image throughout his career. He was not a rebel in a loud way, nor was he someone who completely left the system. Instead, he always stood at the boundary, both participating and observing, both inside and outside. This was not an image-based choice, but a prolonged state of existence, formed from many different layers of experiences in his life. Woody's success, although clear and widely recognized, did not come with the feeling of belonging that many people usually associate with fame. He achieved a career that millions of actors dreamed of, but the feeling of standing at the center of a community or a system had never truly appeared completely. Each major milestone in his career brought external recognition, but inside him the feeling of unity was always missing an important part. Woody Harrelson's life, therefore, could not be seen as a simple, straight line. It was not the story of a person going from hardship to success and stopping there. Instead, it was a multi-layered structure, where layers of experiences overlapped but never fully merged. One layer was the Hollywood actor with global fame. Another layer was the man seeking freedom and quiet outside the system. And even deeper was an inner world that always operated between two opposing states, wanting to belong and wanting to separate. This very division made him always exist in a state of standing in between, not completely belonging to the film world, but also not completely belonging to the world outside it, not completely a public symbol, but also unable to return to the anonymous state as before. He existed in an intermediate space, where every definition became insufficient when applied to him. Over time, this state did not disappear but became a fixed part of Woody Harrelson's identity. He learned to live with it instead of trying to eliminate it. His career continued to develop. His personal life continued to stabilize, but the feeling of belonging to any specific place still always remained hard to grasp. Instead, he existed like a person moving between spaces, adjusting himself according to each environment but never fully dissolving into any of them. And perhaps this very thing had shaped the entire person of Woody Harrelson in the eyes of the world. A successful actor, an independent individual, a person living outside the mold, but above all, a human being who always stood between two worlds that never truly intersected, continuing to exist in that boundary for many decades, not disappearing, not completely belonging, but also never leaving. After all those layers of memories, those choices, those withdrawals and returns, the story of Woody Harrelson's life could no longer be seen as a single-line journey of a Hollywood actor. It became the synthesis of two parallel lives, existing simultaneously throughout decades but rarely truly merging into one. One life took place under the stage lights, where fame, roles, and recognition shaped the way the world saw him. And another life took place in silence, where he tried to live as a person separate from the very system that had created his name. Those two lives did not oppose each other in a loud way or through direct conflict, but existed as two separate flows, continuously running parallel but never completely meeting. In one flow, Woody Harrelson was a global film star, appearing in major movies, loved by the public, followed by the media, and recognized by the industry. In the remaining flow, He was a man seeking quietness, living close to nature, staying away from the noise of Hollywood, and trying to keep a part of himself not defined by the spotlight. Fame and freedom, two concepts that seemed clearly opposed to each other, became two pillars coexisting in Woody's life. But the important thing was that they had never merged into one. Fame brought him a career that very few could achieve, but it did not bring a feeling of inner unity. Freedom brought him space to breathe, to separate himself from system pressure, but it also could not completely erase the existence of fame in the past. This very inability to reconcile created the special structure in his life where every success came with a form of invisible loss. Throughout that long journey, Woody Harrelson achieved accomplishments that many viewed as the peak of an artistic career. He became one of the familiar and respected faces of modern Hollywood, with many iconic roles spanning from television to film, from commercial movies to artistic films. But behind those successes, there was no corresponding state of inner unity. Each time he reached a new milestone, he stepped into a familiar loop. External recognition increased, but the inner feeling of belonging could not keep up. Over time, Woody's life gradually divided into many different pieces. There was a piece that was work, where he was a professional actor, performing roles, joining projects, meeting the expectations of the industry. There was a piece that was personal life, where he tried to maintain peace, build a family, seek stability outside the lights. There was a piece that was the inner world, where questions about identity, about origins, about the meaning of existence never really disappeared. And these pieces did not merge into one complete whole, but existed in parallel like layers stacked on top of each other, but not dissolving. Among all those layers, there were only a few rare moments that brought a feeling close to peace. Those were not the big awards, not the times of recognition on stage, but the very ordinary moments in the family. When he was with his loved ones, when he did not need to maintain a public image, when he did not need to step into any role. Only then could Woody feel a form of quietness not defined by the outside. But even those moments only existed for a short time, before life brought him back to the familiar operating rhythm of the two parallel worlds. Looking back at the entire journey, there was no point that could be called a complete reconciliation between the two lives Woody Harrelson had lived. There was no clear ending for the contradiction between fame and identity, between Hollywood and the separate life, between the public person and the inner person. Instead, what appeared was acceptance, an acceptance that was not loud, not a definitive resolution, but like an understanding that those contradictions had become a fixed part in his life. Woody Harrelson is not a person who has found a way to completely erase the division inside himself. He is also not a person who has merged the two worlds into one. Instead, he is a person who has learned how to live with that incompleteness, continuing to exist in the space between fame and freedom, between the light and the quiet, between the image and the essence. And perhaps that is the real ending of this story. Not the victory of one side or the other, but the prolonged existence of a person who has lived both lives fully, but has also dropped the most important pieces of both in the journey to find himself. Looking back at Woody Harrelson's entire journey, what remains is not only the image of a successful Hollywood star with classic roles like Cheers, The Hunger Games, or True Detective, but a person who has had to live for many decades in a profound split between two worlds that never truly merged into one. One side is the lights of fame, where he is recognized by the whole of America and the world. One side is the quiet life in Maui, where he seeks to withdraw from the very system that created his name. The deepest sadness in Woody's story does not lie in failure, but lies in success itself. When fame cannot fill the inner void, and freedom also cannot erase the shadow of Hollywood or the family past with the father who carried crimes, from a child who grew up under society's discriminatory gaze, to an actor framed in the public image, Woody Harrelson has always had to separate himself in order to exist. as if the true person and the public person never belonged to the same body. That leaves a profound lesson for American audiences. Success, no matter how great, does not mean completeness. If a person loses the unity within himself, his life reminds us that freedom is not only escaping external pressure, but also the ability to face one's own imperfect inner self, and to accept that sometimes peace does not come from reconciling everything, but from learning how to live with the broken pieces of one's own life. If you feel the full of contradictions and profound journey of Woody Harrelson, please hit subscribe to join us in exploring more stories behind the Hollywood spotlight. Thank you for accompanying us, and see you again in the next video, where we continue to dive deep into lives that seem perfect but contain many silent cracks.